Camille Johnson followed every rule, every protocol, every law, until Officer Daniel Parker pulled her over and decided the truth didn't matter. What he didn't know was that the woman he handcuffed on the side of the road wasn't just another civilian. She was a high-ranking U.S. intelligence analyst trained to uncover deception, and in a courtroom packed with reporters, his carefully crafted lies were about to collapse. Camille Johnson had always been meticulous about following the rules. Her career in the intelligence sector demanded precision, awareness, and an ability to remain calm under pressure. It was just another evening as she drove home from work, the hum of the engine a familiar comfort after a long day. The streets were mostly empty, and the sky was just beginning to darken, casting an orange hue over the suburban roads of Northern Virginia. She kept her speed steady, stopped at every light, and obeyed every sign. There was nothing unusual about her drive until the moment she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart rate remained steady as she signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. She wasn't worried. She knew she had done nothing wrong. She reached over to grab her driver's license from her purse, making sure her hands moved slowly, deliberately. Experience had taught her that being cautious during traffic stops was essential. The officer took his time approaching, his silhouette growing larger in her side mirror. His heavy boots crunched against the pavement as he reached her window. She rolled it down and greeted him politely. The officer, a tall man with a rigid posture, looked down at her with an expression she couldn't quite place. His name badge read Parker. He didn't return her greeting. Instead, he immediately asked for her license and registration. Camille handed them over without hesitation, then asked why she had been stopped. Parker didn't answer right away. He took a long moment to examine her documents before finally claiming she had run a stop sign a few blocks back. Camille's mind raced. That wasn't possible. She knew the area well and always paid attention to traffic signs. If she had missed one, she would have noticed. But she also knew better than to argue. Instead, she calmly stated that she didn't believe she had violated any traffic laws and asked if there was any footage or evidence. The officer's expression darkened. He didn't like being questioned. His tone grew sharper as he ordered her to step out of the vehicle. Camille hesitated. There was no legal reason for her to exit the car. She wasn't being detained, and she hadn't committed a crime. She asked again for clarification. That was all it took. Parker's patience snapped. He yanked open the door and grabbed her arm with unnecessary force. The cold steel of handcuffs clamped around her wrists before she even had a chance to react. The street was quiet, but a few onlookers had stopped to watch. Some pulled out their phones, recording as Parker pushed her against the side of her car. "You're resisting," he muttered as he tightened the cuffs. Camille didn't resist. She stood still, her breathing even. Her training had prepared her for high-stress situations, but nothing could have prepared her for this moment, being treated like a criminal without cause. She was shoved into the back of the police cruiser as the weight of the situation settled in. Something was very wrong, and she knew that the real battle was only beginning. Officer Daniel Parker sat at his desk inside the station, typing up his report with an air of confidence. He had done this times before, written up an incident in a way that ensured he remained in control of the narrative. He had learned over the years that as long as he framed his words carefully, there would be no consequences. He wasn't worried about the woman he had arrested. She had questioned his authority, and that alone was enough for him to justify his actions. He had the badge. He had the power. His report stated that Camille Johnson had been driving erratically, failing to stop at a marked intersection. When he initiated the traffic stop, she allegedly refused to cooperate, became aggressive, and ignored multiple commands to exit the vehicle. He included key phrases that he knew would work in his favor: appeared confrontational, posed a potential threat, failed to comply with lawful orders. He even stated that she had attempted to reach for something inside the vehicle, a subtle way of implying that he had acted out of concern for his safety. It was a formula he had perfected over the years, and it had never failed him before. Meanwhile, Camille sat alone in a holding cell, her wrists sore from the tightness of the handcuffs. The reality of her situation was sinking in, but she wasn't panicked. She had worked in intelligence long enough to know how these things played out. She knew the law, the legal procedures, and the way officers like Parker operated. She had seen cases like this before, where a fabricated report could turn an innocent person into a criminal with just a few carefully chosen words. She also knew that the truth, when presented correctly, had the power to dismantle even the most carefully constructed lies. Outside the station, news of her arrest was already spreading. The bystanders who had recorded the incident had started sharing the footage online. The videos showed Camille remaining calm and composed, following every instruction given to her. Nowhere in the footage did she appear aggressive or uncooperative. The contrast between the official police report and the reality caught on camera was glaring. Within hours, legal advocates and community activists were taking an interest in her case. Back inside, Camille was brought out of the holding cell and taken for processing. Her personal belongings had been confiscated, including her work identification badge. When the officer on duty examined it, his expression shifted slightly. It was not the ID of an ordinary citizen. The emblem of a U.S. intelligence agency was printed clearly on the front. He hesitated for a moment before placing it back into the evidence bag, but Camille had seen the flicker of recognition in his eyes. The moment they realized who she was, things would start to change. Officer Parker, however, remained unaware. He believed he had successfully contained the situation, believing that his version of events would go unquestioned. But the foundation of his lie had already started to crack, and soon, everything he had written in that report would be torn apart piece by piece. The courtroom was packed on the day Camille Johnson's case was heard. Journalists, activists, and concerned citizens had gathered, drawn by the growing controversy surrounding her arrest. The footage of her traffic stop had already gone viral, raising questions about the integrity of the officer who had detained her. Despite this, Officer Daniel Parker remained confident as he walked into the courtroom, his uniform crisp, his posture straight. He had been in situations like this before, and he had always come out unscathed. His report was airtight, his testimony rehearsed. He believed there was nothing to worry about. The prosecution laid out their case first, presenting Parker's official report as the foundation of their argument. According to his statement, Camille had been erratic, aggressive, and non-compliant. He described her behavior as hostile, claiming he had been forced to restrain her for his own safety. His words were carefully chosen, each sentence designed to paint Camille as a threat. As he spoke, his confidence grew. He had done this before. The system had always protected him. Then it was time for the defense to respond. Camille's attorney remained calm as he approached the stand, holding a tablet in his hand. Without wasting a moment, he played the footage captured by bystanders. The room fell silent as the video showed a very different version of events from the one Parker had described. Camille had been calm and cooperative. She had asked reasonable questions. At no point did she appear aggressive. Most damning of all, there was no sign of her resisting arrest. The contrast between Parker's sworn testimony and the footage was impossible to ignore. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The judge's expression hardened. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Officer Parker remained rigid in his seat, but his confidence had visibly wavered. His years of experience told him what was happening. He was losing control of the narrative. His carefully constructed lie was beginning to collapse. Then Camille's attorney revealed something that sent shockwaves through the room. He placed her work ID on the evidence table, its government seal glinting under the overhead lights. Camille was not just any civilian. She was an intelligence analyst with a high security clearance. She had spent years working in classified operations, trained to recognize legal loopholes, law enforcement procedures, and tactics used by officers like Parker. She understood the system better than he ever could, and she had the resources to expose corruption when she saw it. The realization hit Parker like a weight pressing down on his chest. He had arrested a woman who not only knew her rights, but had the expertise and credibility to dismantle his entire case. His false report, which he had assumed would go unchallenged, was now a piece of evidence against him. The very words he had written, the exaggerated claims he had made, were being used to prove his misconduct. The judge ordered a recess, but the damage had already been done. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. The truth had been laid bare, and Parker's career, once untouchable, was now hanging by a thread. As the courtroom reconvened, Officer Daniel Parker sat at the defense table, his once unshakable confidence now eroding under the weight of the evidence against him. The video footage had dismantled his version of events, and Camille Johnson's credentials had only made matters worse. She wasn't just another civilian caught in a routine traffic stop. She was someone with the knowledge and credibility to expose every flaw in his fabricated report. The air in the room had shifted. The judge's stern gaze never left him, and the murmurs from the public gallery made it clear that the case had taken a turn he hadn't expected. The defense continued its onslaught, bringing forward more evidence that painted a damning picture of Parker's history. Internal affairs investigators had begun reviewing his past reports, and what they found raised immediate concerns. Camille's case was not an isolated incident. Over the years, Parker had been the subject of multiple complaints from civilians, all alleging misconduct, excessive force, and falsified reports. In each case, the complaints had been quietly dismissed, buried under bureaucratic red tape. But now, with video proof contradicting his sworn statement, those past allegations were being reconsidered. A senior investigator from Internal Affairs took the stand, presenting findings that further weakened Parker's defense. A pattern had emerged, one that suggested Parker had a habit of manipulating reports to justify unnecessary arrests. His history, once shielded by the thin blue wall of silence, was now being laid bare in front of a judge and jury. His superiors, eager to distance themselves from the scandal, had already placed him on administrative leave pending further investigation. The weight of the evidence was no longer just about Camille's case. It had become an inquiry into Parker's entire career. The prosecution, recognizing that their case was falling apart, began scrambling to adjust their strategy. But the facts were undeniable. The video footage, Camille's professional background, and Parker's questionable history had turned what was supposed to be a simple trial into a full-scale exposure of systemic failure. The once protected officer was now finding himself abandoned by the very system he had relied on for so long. Parker's expression was tense as he listened to the proceedings. His attorney had advised him not to take the stand, knowing that any attempt to defend himself would likely result in further contradictions. The best he could hope for now was damage control, but the damage had already been done. Outside the courtroom, the media had turned Camille's story into a national headline. Activists, legal experts, and public figures weighed in on the case, calling it yet another example of unchecked police misconduct. The department's reputation was on the line, and officials were under increasing pressure to act. Camille, despite being the victim in all of this, had remained composed throughout. She had seen firsthand how the justice system worked, and she knew that this moment, this exposure of the truth, was bigger than just her own fight. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, one thing became clear. Parker was no longer in control of the situation. The lies he had carefully constructed were crumbling faster than he could contain them, and his fate now rested in the hands of the court. The final day of the trial arrived with a sense of anticipation hanging thick in the air. The courtroom was even more crowded than before, with reporters lining the back rows and legal analysts eager to witness the verdict. Camille Johnson sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, her expression unreadable. She had done everything she needed to do, presented the truth, exposed the lies, and let the evidence speak for itself. Now, the decision was out of her hands. Officer Daniel Parker sat rigidly beside his attorney, his face drained of color. The weight of the case had become unbearable, and the realization had finally set in. The department had abandoned him, public sentiment had turned against him, and his credibility was beyond repair. What had started as a routine traffic stop had spiraled into a scandal that threatened to end his career and possibly send him to prison. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent. He began by addressing the overwhelming contradictions in Parker's sworn testimony. The video footage, the police dispatch recordings, and Camille's calm demeanor had made it impossible to believe the officer's version of events. The judge spoke firmly, stating that Parker had violated the public's trust by fabricating a police report and committing perjury. His actions had not only endangered an innocent citizen, but had also cast doubt on every case he had ever worked on. The final ruling was swift and decisive. All charges against Camille were dropped, and the judge condemned the wrongful arrest as an abuse of power. But the consequences for Parker were far more severe. He was charged with perjury, falsifying official documents, and excessive use of force. His suspension was immediately upgraded to termination, and an independent review of his past cases was ordered to determine if other wrongful arrests had been covered up. He would no longer be shielded by his badge. The courtroom buzzed as the verdict sank in. For Parker, it was the ultimate downfall, one that he had never seen coming. His years of unchallenged authority had given him the illusion of invincibility, but in the end, the truth had been his undoing. Outside, crowds had gathered, awaiting the final outcome. When Camille stepped outside, reporters rushed toward her, microphones extended, cameras flashing. She remained composed, answering only briefly before moving through the crowd. She wasn't interested in personal fame. What mattered was that justice had been served. The impact of the case rippled far beyond the courtroom. Parker's conviction led to a broader investigation into the department's handling of complaints against officers. New policies were introduced to prevent similar abuses of power. The conversation about accountability in law enforcement grew louder, and Camille's story became a symbol of resilience and the power of truth. For Camille, life returned to normal, but she carried the experience with her. She knew she had not just defended herself, she had exposed a system that relied on silence and compliance. And in doing so, she had proven that no one, not even those with a badge, was above the law.